sometimes our kids are better at grief than we are. They can be gifted at this dual process thing. So what can we do to help our kids through their grief experience? With younger kids, we work really hard to try to keep things the same as we can. Okay, so that's trying to keep the schedule the same, the activities, the bedtime rituals, the meal times, as much as we can. I know that this can be hard, particularly if you have your own grief symptoms, but it really does help to contain the situation. Now, if you have a child that's a little bit maybe quieter about their loved one being gone, or doesn't like to talk about it because the sadness kind of comes up, you can remind them that it's okay for the sadness to come up every now and again, that it passes, right? I think a good rule of thumb is to actually casually bring up the person that you have lost in everyday conversations, to model that. You can kind of say things like, oh, Mom would kill us if she saw this mess, or Grandpa would have loved this day, wouldn't he? Or John would have never let Beth get away with that, right? Stuff like that. You also need to communicate that it's perfectly okay to be angry with the person who's gone, right? Because sometimes we are, even if that makes no sense. And that sometimes we feel guilty for no reason when we lose people. Encourage them to talk about this stuff, because sometimes they also have these tiny little things in there that they feel mad about or that they feel bad about. And that's just the normal stuff of relationships, but kids have their own little regrets too, One thing to be mindful of, though, too, is that sometimes our kids are better at grief than we are. They can be gifted at this dual process thing. They can be sad, mad one moment and then completely immersed in the fun and joy of another moment, which is really healthy. If you're also grieving, you may be having a harder time with that, and that can affect your child. So they may feel like they have to subdue their joy or mind you, or they may sometimes want to kind of stay away from the house because maybe the house feels heavy, and then they might feel guilty about that, okay? So I think that these are things to watch out for. They might also just simply be mad at you that you're not as much fun as you used to be, or that you're not the same as, a loved one that that everyone has lost. So we're trying to kind of get that balance right between allowing the sadness, but then also allowing normal life to just be good, okay? Now, it could also be that you are the one that is busy with the moving on, either healthily or in an effort to distract. And that could be affecting your child, right? They might be going a little slower. And if you're trying to move on, they could feel a little lonely in their grief. And they might be frustrated with you. And they might refuse to kind of engage with your plans or get on board with changes that you want to make. So they might start kind of reacting when they see you moving on. So for example, maybe when a parent starts dating, or if you want to move house, or if you're doing things that the lost loved one didn't like to do. Stuff like this, okay? It can almost feel like a betrayal of sorts. And it's important just to be talking about that, right? Okay. So it's important to think about this and how our child's grief might be different from ours, and make sure there's plenty of room for different reactions in different timelines. Generally, when we're talking about it and thinking about it, we don't need to be too worried. It's when nobody is talking about it or thinking about it that we tend to get the problems, okay? Most parents will tell you it takes a lot of bravery and a lot of patience to keep parenting effectively when they're experiencing their own grief themselves. Now, there is one last thing I want to be mindful of too, and that's neurodiversity in our children and how that may affect how they grieve, right? This may take an extra dose of awareness and patience. For example, children affected by autism may not express grief in a typical way or way that's deemed socially appropriate, and they may need more support in labeling their emotions or understanding how to express them with others. A child with attention deficit may need more help kind of self-regulating difficult emotions. Both ASD and ADD can bring with it kind of rigid routines or behaviors, and more often than not, loss and change really disrupt those behaviors and those routines. And that's kind of an added burden for someone who's neurodiverse. So it's important that they get that extra consideration that they need when managing a life-changing event. And remember, too, that anything that is harder for kids is harder for their parents, grandparents, and caregivers, because we are the ones supporting them through it. So you have to take good care of yourself, too.